This week's Farm Basics is brought to you by satshot.com. Satellites aren't just for NASA anymore. Use the power of satellite imagery to create variable rate management zones in your fields. To reduce input costs and increase yields on your farm, go to satshot.com.
There are a lot of decisions that farmers have to make. In today's Farm Basics, we'll talk about one of those decisions they make around this time of year. When do you harvest crops?
Well, that's pretty easy, Darren. You just wait until the neighbors get started and then you go.
Oh, that's always a good guide, Brad. No, seriously, when we're looking at lots of different crops on the farm, like for example, for our farm, we're raising corn and soybeans and wheat. It is a tough question. When do you start? Do you start now? A lot of people will say, well, boy, I don't want to start today. It's Friday and I'm going to go over the weekend. No, let's wait until Monday to start. Well, how do you know when it's the right time to go?
Well, the most important thing you're looking at is the seeds have to be fully mature. So once they're fully mature, you're in pretty good shape, except for the fact that in most cases, that seed is going to have to be stored somewhere, like a grain bin or an elevator. So if you're going to store the seed, whether it's corn or soybeans, wheat, any crop, if you're going to store that seed, it most likely has to be down to a certain level of moisture. So for example, with corn, no elevator wants to take corn that is above 15% moisture. In other words, 85% dry material and 15% water inside that seed. That's ideally what they're looking for. Or they'd like to have even a little more dry matter and a little less water. But the problem is if you have seed that is too wet and you put that in a bin, you store it anywhere, it's going to end up spoiling, and that's obviously a bad thing.
Well, if you bring grain, like corn, for example, say you brought it in with 17% water in the grain or 17% moisture, what the elevator would do is typically dock you. They'll say, okay, well, it's 17% moisture. We're only paying for 15% moisture corn, so we're going to dock you so many cents per bushel to get that value down a little bit, because we've got to do something to that grain to be able to store it. Plus, you've brought us a whole bunch of extra water that we really don't need. Now, the other side of that is what happens if it gets too dry out in the field? Let's say that corn gets down to 12 or 13% in the field. Well, then you're hauling 88% dry matter to the elevator. The elevator's getting a great deal. They aren't going to pay you a premium because you didn't bring them water. They're going to say, sure, we'll take that grain. That's nice and dry. And you've lost the money in your field. So there's that fine point where you have to figure out what your moisture content is in grain like corn, for example, and around 15%, you want to bring that in. But if you get down to 12%, you've lost money by leaving it in the field too long.
Now, let's just say, for example, that you had grain that was mostly dry matter and down to 12% moisture, like Darren is saying. Theoretically, if you added some more water to this grain, you could sell the elevator more water for the same price as corn, or the same price as soybeans,
it's not
whatever.
really legal to hose down that load of grain with a hose of water, but what you could do is, let's say you were storing it in a grain bin, you could run some aeration fans on a humid day, let the grain accumulate some moisture naturally through humidity in the air, and there's nothing wrong with that. That could be done, but most farmers aren't going to do that. They want to store grain that's dry, and grain elevators feel the same way.
Okay, let's take a different angle here with the when can you harvest thing. If you go out in a soybean field, for example, early in the morning, there's a lot of moisture. Like even this morning when we're out here, my shoes are getting wet, there's dew. Well, with soybeans, they're very particular on when they can be harvested because you've got to break open those pods and get the seeds out. That's the purpose of the combine, is to break the pods open, get the seeds out. You can't break the pods very well though if they're damp. So typically with soybeans on our farm, we never start harvesting soybeans till about 11 o'clock in the morning, or maybe even noon some days. So things dry out, the humidity goes down, and we can actually split open those bean pods and the bean seed comes out. And very often in the evening, we have to shut down at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, something like that, when the dew starts coming back on. So it is a little tricky.
Well, here's the other side of that too. Sometimes we like to harvest when grain is a little bit too wet. Let's take soybeans, for example. Once they get down to about 14% moisture, for us, we say, boy, soybeans can really dry down fast in the field. It could be 14% in the morning, and by the end of the day, it could be down to 10 or 11% on a hot, sunny day. So we want to get out and get started, even if the beans are just a little bit too moist early in the day. We know we're going to get docked when we go to the elevator, but we'll pencil that out and figure, you know what? If we lose 5 or 6 cents here or maybe 10 cents here, I'm going to pick it up by not losing that extra moisture later in the day. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the early side just so I don't lose too much on the backside.
As long as we can open up those pods. And that's the whole trick. Every crop is a little bit different. So when we talk about when to harvest, obviously when we get down towards the end of the season, the whole plant is going to be dying. What's happening in that plant? It's maturing. Every plant is cannibalistic. It takes the energy out of the stem, out of the roots, out of the leaves, puts it into the seed, and when it's doing that, the rest of the plant is dying, it's shriveling up, it's shrinking, and then you just have to get out there and harvest when you feel it's fit on your farm, and every farmer has to go through this. And you know, the other big issue we've got is you can't harvest everything in one day, I mean, unless you only have a few acres, so you've got to kind of pick and choose. In other words, there's a lot of art to this rather than science. And there are a lot of factors that come into play, but the whole thing is the farmer wants to get his crop off the field as quickly as he can in the fall, as soon as it's ready, and he can store it properly and everything, because winter is coming, especially in our neck of the woods.
Well, there are a lot of tough decisions to make on the farm, like when to harvest. We'll talk with Brian about one of those tough decisions about weed control during our Weed of the Week segment later. Can you identify this week's weed?